If you think playing Twister with a ghost is strange, you're right. But that's not even the strangest part of what happened. It's what happened after that really made me question what I'd done. I guess I should start by explaining how I ended up in this mess in the first place. It was mid-October, right around my birthday. I had just turned 16. My parents didn't do anything special, just the usual cake after dinner, a couple of presents, and awkward conversations where they kept asking why I wasn't more involved in youth group or trying out for cheerleading. I never knew how to answer that stuff. I've never been the social type. So I just asked for one thing that might make me feel less alone. I wanted a Ouija board, a simple, cheap one, like you could pick up at the corner store or order online for less than $20. I'd read about them on forums and thought it might be interesting to see if I could get a ghost to talk back, especially since I'd been diving into anything occult-related lately. Spells, rituals, stories about ghosts, I devoured them all. My parents, though, they flipped out. "Absolutely not," my mum had shouted, as if I'd asked for a tattoo of the devil on my forehead instead of a silly game board. "We don't bring that kind of evil into this house." Dad backed her up, crossing his arms and looking all stern and serious. "We raised you better than that, Helen. I don't know where you got the idea, but that thing is nothing but a gateway for demons." I remember standing there in the middle of the living room, clutching my birthday card, wishing the floor would swallow me up. I tried to explain that it was just for fun, that I didn't believe in any of it, but they wouldn't hear it. By the end of the conversation, my request had somehow become a major family crisis. They dragged me to church for a special sermon that weekend and made me say a rosary with them every night for a week. Happy birthday to me. But they couldn't stop me from thinking about it. Couldn't stop me from wondering, what if I didn't need a Ouija board? What if I could use something else? I'd read about people using all kinds of weird items for spirit communication, mirrors, keys, even letters. And then, on this tiny, obscure forum I'd stumbled across, someone had posted about using a twister mat for summoning. I don't know if they were serious or joking, but the idea had wormed its way into my brain, and the more I thought about it, the more I couldn't let it go. A twister mat, why not? It wasn't like I had anything to lose. So, one night, when my parents were asleep and the house was dark and quiet, I decided to give it a try. Setting up was easy. I just grabbed the old Twister game from the closet, the one we'd had since I was little. The box was dusty, the mat crumpled and faded, but it would do. I spread it out on the floor of my bedroom and pulled out the spinner, feeling silly the whole time. If my parents knew what I was up to, they'd probably have a stroke. But they didn't know, and that's what made it thrilling. I sat cross-legged beside the mat, placed a single candle at each corner, and whispered a few lines I'd scribbled down from one of my research books, a basic invitation, something like, "If there's any spirit willing to play, I invite you to join me." I tossed in a strand of my hair for good measure, just like I'd read. Then I waited, and waited. Nothing happened. The room was as silent and still as ever, just the flicker of the candles casting wavy shadows on the twister mat. I sighed, leaning back against my bed. Maybe I had been stupid to think this would work. "Guess you're not into Twister," I muttered. But just as I was about to blow out the candles and crawl back into bed, the spinner twitched. Once. Twice. Then, very slowly, it turned, the plastic arrow scraping softly against the cardboard as it settled on left-hand red. My heart nearly stopped. I stared at the board, half expecting it to just be a trick of the wind or my imagination, but the spinner stayed where it was, pointing resolutely at that red circle. I swallowed hard. This was crazy, but I leaned forward, hesitating for just a second, then placed my left hand on the red circle. Nothing. No eerie music, no cold gust of wind. The room didn't turn upside down. It was just me, my hand on a faded piece of plastic. I almost laughed at how silly I felt. But before I could move, the spinner shifted again. "Right hand green." My eyes widened. "You've got to be kidding me," I whispered. But sure enough, the spinner was pointing squarely at a green circle. For a second, I just stared at it, my heart racing, fingers trembling. Someone or something wanted to play. I moved my right hand to the green circle, half expecting the spinner to stop or the candles to blow out or something to make sense again. But the spinner just kept going. Left foot yellow. My breath caught in my throat. Every hair on my neck stood on end. This wasn't real. This couldn't be real. But there I was, left foot on yellow, hands spread awkwardly across the mat, and then it happened. A cold, icy touch brushed against my wrist. I jerked, almost falling over. My head whipped around, eyes scanning the empty room, but there was no one there. Nothing there. Nothing but that lingering chill, like the feeling you get when you stand too close to a freezer on a hot day. It was playing with me. The spinner turned again. Right foot blew. Before I could even move, I felt it, a pressure on the mat, the faintest sense of something shifting beside me. It wasn't solid, not really, more like a thick, chilled mist with a purpose, and when I stretched my foot over to the blue circle, it was right there, inches away from me. I couldn't see it, but I could feel it. My whole body shook with a mix of fear and excitement. We kept going, me and this ghost, this spirit, my invisible opponent. It took 10 minutes, maybe less, but somehow I won. The spinner stopped, landing nowhere in particular. The room warmed instantly, the candles flickering softly, and I was left kneeling on the twister mat, staring at the empty space where that icy, ghostly presence had been. I won? I whispered to the darkness. No answer. Of course. But I could have sworn I felt a soft, cool breeze brush against my cheek, almost like a congratulatory pat on the shoulder. I laughed, a short, breathless sound, the kind you make when you're not sure if you're going crazy or if the world just took a hard left turn into the weird. Guess we're gonna be friends now, huh? I murmured softly, glancing around the empty room. I didn't know what I'd just done. I didn't know what kind of friend I'd made, but I wasn't alone anymore, and that at least felt like a win. After that first night, I couldn't stop thinking about what happened. I mean, wouldn't you? I'm not crazy. It wasn't some overactive imagination or a trick of the candlelight. I felt something there, something real, something I couldn't explain. And so the next night, when my parents went to bed, I did it again. The setup was the same. Twister mat on the floor, candles at the corners, a single strand of hair tossed onto the board as a kind of personal seal. I sat there cross-legged, heart hammering in my chest, and whispered, "Do you want to play again?" Nothing. For a second I wondered if the whole thing had been a fluke. But then the spinner twitched. Once. Twice. Slowly it turned, and the plastic arrow landed on left-hand red. I grinned, unable to stop myself. "I knew you'd come back," I murmured. I moved my left hand to the red circle, feeling that familiar chill settle over my fingers. The spirit was back. This time I wasn't scared. If anything, I was excited. I started talking to it, whispering little things as we played, random thoughts I wouldn't have shared with anyone else. Things like how school was boring, how my parents didn't understand me, how I felt like I didn't have anyone to talk to. I don't know why I opened up. Maybe because in some strange way I felt heard. The spirit didn't speak back, of course, but every now and then I'd feel a soft brush of cold air against my cheek or the lightest touch on my shoulder, as if it was trying to say, "I'm listening." We played Twister for what felt like hours. The whole time I felt the spirit's presence next to me, its cold, weightless form brushing against my skin whenever we got close. And when the game finally ended, with me twisted awkwardly across the mat, it almost felt like a shared victory, a secret between just the two of us. That was how it started. Night after night I'd sneak out of bed and set up the game, and each time, without fail, the spirit would appear. We'd play for a while, sometimes Twister, sometimes something else. I even tried cards once, spreading them out on my bedroom floor and inviting it to move one. To my shock, the cards fluttered and shifted, and a cold presence nudged a single card toward me. The Ace of Spades. I remember laughing, staring at that card in disbelief. This wasn't just some random haunting. The spirit could think. It understood what it was doing. It wasn't until about a week later that I realized I'd started thinking of the spirit as my friend. I know how that sounds, but you have to understand, I didn't have anyone else. I'd never really fit in at school. The girls in my class were always whispering and giggling about boys and fashion, while I preferred reading books or daydreaming in the library. And at home, I was either invisible or a disappointment, depending on what kind of mood my parents were in. But this spirit, it didn't judge me. It didn't make me feel stupid or boring or weird. It was there, and that was enough. At first I didn't tell my parents. What could I say? "Hey, Mom, Dad, guess what? I made friends with a ghost using the twister mat from the closet. Yeah, that would have gone over well, but it was more than that. I didn't want to share my ghost. It was mine, my secret. That all changed the day my mum caught me talking to it. It was a Saturday afternoon, and I'd gotten cocky. I'd forgotten to lock my door, forgotten to be careful. I was on my bedroom floor, cards spread out around me, my invisible friend nudging one toward me, the King of Hearts. Nice try, I teased, reaching out to pick up the card, but I'm still gonna win. Helen. The door creaked open, and my heart nearly exploded out of my chest. I scrambled to my feet, knocking cards everywhere, as my mum stepped into the room. Her eyes narrowed as she took in the mess of cards, the way I'd been crouched on the floor, and, worst of all, the empty spot across from me, where I'd been pretending someone else was playing. "Who were you talking to?" she demanded. No one," I stammered, my face burning. "I was just playing by myself." "You're too old for this, Helen. What's wrong with you?" She sounded more bewildered than angry, like she was trying to figure out if this was some new phase of teenage rebellion or just another sign that I was a complete weirdo. "You're 16, not 6. Why are you acting like this?" I bit my lip, heart hammering in my chest. "I'm not acting like anything. I'm fine." "Fine?" she repeated. "You're fine? Helen, you were talking to yourself like a crazy person. And what is this?" She stepped forward, snatching up one of the cards. "Is this another one of your occult things? Are you trying to summon something?" "No," I lied, even as my pulse raced with panic. I couldn't let her find out. If she knew what I'd been doing, if she knew I'd been playing games with a spirit, she'd lose her mind. But she didn't believe me. I could see it in her eyes. She was scared of me, and that realization cut deeper than anything else she could have said. That night I didn't play any games. I just sat there in the dark, staring at the twister mat rolled up in the corner, and whispered into the silence, "Are you there?" At first, I didn't think the spirit would answer. The room was still, my breath the only sound. Then, slowly, I felt it. A soft, icy breeze against my cheek, like the ghost was brushing away a tear I hadn't realized I'd shed. "I'm sorry," I whispered, feeling stupid and childish. I can't play tonight." The room stayed cold for a long time, and then, as gently as it had come, the presence faded away. My parents started watching me more closely after that. They didn't know exactly what was wrong, but they knew something was. And I, stupidly, let it get to me. Instead of waiting until they were asleep, I started sneaking little games during the day, whenever they were out running errands or at work. The spirit didn't seem to mind. It showed up whenever I called, just a chill in the air, a light touch on my shoulder. I even started bringing out board games I hadn't touched in years, like Monopoly and Scrabble. I'd play for hours, talking to it, laughing with it, the way you would with any friend. And for the first time in forever, I felt happy. Then one afternoon, I decided to play Scrabble with it. I set the board up, feeling that same thrill I always did when I called for my ghostly friend. The room grew cold almost immediately. My spirit was right there, waiting. "Okay," I murmured, placing the tiles on the board. "Let's play a little differently this time. I want to know who you are." The tiles clicked as I arranged my first word, name. The air shifted, that faint icy breeze swirling around me. Slowly the tiles on the board began to move. One by one, letters slid into place, the board shifting and rattling as the spirit spelled out its answer. Helen. I stared at the board, blinking in surprise. Then I snorted. "Really?" I said, raising an eyebrow at the empty air around me. "That's what you're going with? You're going to call yourself Helen, like me?" The room seemed to hum with a strange, whimsical energy. I could almost feel the spirit's smugness, as if it were grinning at some private joke. I shook my head, unable to hold back a chuckle. "Wow, you really have a sense of humor, huh?" The spirit didn't respond, of course, but as I looked down at the board, at those simple letters, I couldn't help but smile. It was silly and a little ridiculous, but it also made a strange kind of sense. "Well, Helen," I said softly, brushing my fingers over the tiles, "I guess that makes us namesakes." The air around me seemed to shimmer, the faintest hint of warmth brushing against my cheek, like a ghostly caress. I chuckled again, shaking my head. "Yeah, okay, nice to meet you too." My parents noticed. They noticed everything. One evening, I was sitting on the living room floor with the twister mat spread out again. I'd been twisting myself into knots, laughing softly whenever I bumped into that cold, ghostly presence, when I heard the unmistakable sound of the front door creaking open. "Helen!" my dad's voice thundered from the hallway. I froze, my breath hitching in my chest. The ghost froze too, the air around me suddenly cold, tense. "What is this?" My father stormed into the room, his face red, his eyes wide with fury. He grabbed the twister mat and yanked it up, sending me sprawling backward. "You're doing this again? What kind of sick joke are you playing?" I could barely breathe, my heart pounding in my chest. "Dad, stop! It's not—" "Not what?" he bellowed, shaking the mat in my face. "You're inviting demons into our home? You want to damn yourself to hell, is that it?" "It's not a demon," I shouted, tears stinging my eyes. "It's not what you think. I'm not—" But he wouldn't listen. He turned on me, his face twisted with fear and anger. "I don't care what you think it is, Helen. This thing you're playing with isn't some innocent game. You're playing with fire, and you're going to burn us all." "I'm not," I screamed, fists clenched, shaking with rage. "It's not dangerous, it's not hurting anyone, it's my friend." "Friend?" He spat the word like it was poison. "You think this is your friend? You're delusional, Helen. This ends now." Before I could stop him, he stormed to the front door and threw the twister mat outside, letting it fall into the mud and leaves. I let out a choked sob, scrambling to my feet. "No, what are you doing?" I cried, reaching for the door. "Give it back, you can't just—" "Enough!" My dad's voice cracked through the room like a whip. "You're done with this, Helen. No more games, no more spirits. I'm calling Father Martin, and he's going to put a stop to this once and for all." That night, the house was thick with tension. My parents barely spoke to me as they made dinner, glancing at me with wary, anxious eyes. I sat at the kitchen table, arms wrapped around myself, trembling with a mixture of fury and fear. I could feel it, the absence, the emptiness. Without the twister mat, without my games, it was like a part of me had been ripped away. I knew the spirit, Helen, was still there, still watching, but it was distant now, its presence weak and strained, as if it didn't know what to do without the familiar rituals. Father Martin arrived just after sunset. He was a short, round man in his 50s, with a gentle smile and kind eyes that made my skin crawl. He looked at me like I was some lost lamb that needed saving, and I hated him for it. But I kept my mouth shut as he settled into the living room, my parents hovering anxiously at the edges of the room. "Helen," he said softly, folding his hands in his lap. "Your parents have told me a bit about what's been happening. They're worried about you." "They don't need to be," I muttered, staring at the floor. "I'm fine." "Are you?" he asked, raising an eyebrow. "They say you've been playing games with something you've invited into your home." "It's not like that," I shot back, clenching my fists. "I didn't invite anything, it came to me, and it's not dangerous." He nodded slowly, watching me with that same infuriatingly calm expression. "I see, but Helen, sometimes these things, these spirits, they're not what they seem. They can deceive us, make us think they're friendly, even when they have darker intentions." "I know what I'm doing," I said sharply. "It's not tricking me." Father Martin sighed softly, like he'd expected this. "Helen," he said gently, "will you let me pray with you?" "No," I snapped before I could stop myself. "I don't want—" "Helen," my dad growled from behind me, "let him help you." I turned on him, fists clenched, heart pounding in my chest. "You don't understand," I shouted. "It's not evil. It's not dangerous. You're just scared because you don't get it. You don't get me." "Helen," my mum whispered, tears in her eyes. Please just let him try." My chest ached. I looked around the room. The twister mat gone. My books and notes thrown away. The candles they tossed out with the trash. Everything that had made me feel like I was finally something was gone, and they were looking at me like I was the problem. I turned back to Father Martin, swallowing hard. "Fine," I muttered, hating how weak I sounded. "Do whatever you want, but it won't work." Father Martin knelt in the middle of the living room, clutching his rosary, and began to pray. At first it was just words, a soft murmur of Latin, the sound filling the room like a quiet chant. My parents bowed their heads, their lips moving silently in unison. I just stood there glaring at them, arms crossed, resisting the urge to bolt. But then the air began to change. It started as a faint chill, creeping in around the edges of the room. My breath hitched, heart stuttering. I knew that feeling. I'd felt it 100 times before. The spirit was her. My throat tightened, and I felt the sting of tears burning my eyes. No, It was trying to defend itself. You were hurting it, and... Enough! My dad roared, cutting me off. He grabbed my shoulders, shaking me violently. Do you hear yourself? You sound insane. This is what happens when you mess around with things you don't understand. You killed a man, Helen. You killed him. I flinched at the word, the accusation slicing through me like a knife. I didn't. Stop it, my mum screamed suddenly, her voice shrill and hysterical. She staggered forward, clutching at my dad's arm. Stop yelling at her. She's our daughter. Our daughter just murdered a priest, Claire, my dad shot back, jerking away from her. How are you not seeing that? My mum's eyes darted between us, wild and terrified. We need to call someone. We need... No. My dad's voice was ice cold, each word like a death sentence. No one can know about this. If the church finds out, if the police find out... He turned to me, his eyes burning with hatred. You're not saying anything, do you understand? I stared at him, numb and shaking. But... Do you understand? He snarled, his grip tightening on my shoulders until it hurt. Yes, I whispered, my voice barely audible. Yes, I understand. The next few hours passed in a blur. My parents moved like ghosts through the house, whispering frantically to each other, casting fearful glances in my direction. I watched in horrified silence as my dad dragged Father Martin's body into the back room, his face set in a grim mask. I didn't dare ask what they were planning to do with it. I just stood there, trembling, my eyes fixed on the empty space in the living room where Helen had appeared. The air still felt cold, heavy with the lingering presence of something that shouldn't have been there, something I had invited in. It was my fault. I'd brought her here. I'd made this happen. I killed him. The thought echoed through my mind, relentless and unyielding, twisting in my chest until I thought I might be sick. I squeezed my eyes shut, wrapping my arms around myself, trying to shut it out. But it was no use. The truth was there, staring me in the face. I was a murderer. When I finally stumbled up to my room hours later, I was exhausted. My parents had locked themselves in their bedroom, leaving me alone to grapple with what had happened. I felt hollow, numb, my mind a swirling storm of guilt and confusion and fear. I sank onto the edge of my bed, burying my face in my hands. Helen, I whispered, my voice shaking. Are you there? Silence. Please, I begged, choking on a sob. I need to talk to you. Just please come back. The room stayed quiet and still, the only sound my ragged breathing. For a moment, I thought she was gone, that she'd left for good. And then, slowly, the air around me grew colder. I looked up, tears blurring my vision, and there she was, a faint shimmer in the corner of my room, barely visible. She didn't move, didn't reach out, just hovered there, her form trembling as if she were struggling to hold herself together. Helen, I breathed, my heart aching. I'm so sorry. I didn't mean for this to happen. I didn't know. The spirit shifted, her outline flickering, and I felt it, a soft, almost imperceptible brush of cold against my cheek, like a tear made of ice. It's not your fault, I whispered, my throat tight. They hurt you. I didn't want them to hurt you. She seemed to shimmer, her form pulsing gently, and I got the sense that she was listening, understanding. But there was something else there too, something darker, an undercurrent of anger, of rage simmering just beneath the surface. I wish I could make them stop, I whispered, my voice breaking. But they won't listen. A loud crash echoed through the house, making me jump. My head whipped around, heart pounding, and I heard my parents' voices, muffled, frantic, coming from downstairs. Another crash, followed by a string of curses. Helen, help! My mum's voice shrieked, high-pitched and panicked. Stop it, please, just make it stop. The blood drained from my face. I turned back to the spirit, my pulse racing. What are you doing? I whispered. Helen, what? But she was already gone. I bolted out of my room, my feet pounding against the hardwood floors as I tore down the hallway. I could hear the chaos in the living room, furniture toppling, glass shattering, my parents' shouts mingling with a low, guttural growl that made my blood run cold. Helen, stop! I screamed, skidding to a halt at the top of the stairs. The living room was a whirlwind of destruction. The coffee table lay shattered on the floor, shards of glass and porcelain scattered everywhere. The couch was flipped over, one leg broken clean off. My parents were huddled in the corner, my dad clutching my mum's shoulders, his face twisted in a mixture of terror and fury. And in the center of it all, hovering in the air like a storm made of shadow and ice, was Helen. She looked different now, darker, more solid. Her form rippled and churned, a writhing mass of shadow that pulsed with a strange, unnatural energy. The air around her crackled, distorting like heat waves in the dead of summer. "Stop it!" I screamed, stumbling down the stairs. "Helen, please stop!" But she didn't stop. If anything, the storm only grew stronger, the air filling with a high, keening wail that set my teeth on edge. My dad shouted something, but his words were lost in the din. I could only watch, helpless, as the spirit turned toward them. Her eyes, black and empty, locking onto my mum's terrified face. "Don't hurt them!" I cried, throwing myself between them. "Helen, please, don't—" The wailing stopped. For a moment, the world seemed to hang in suspended silence. Helen hovered there, her dark form trembling, as if torn between two forces, one that wanted to lash out, to destroy, and one that listened. And then, with a shuddering, almost painful jerk, she vanished. The silence that followed was deafening. I stood there, chest heaving, my whole body trembling. My parents were staring at me, wide-eyed and shaking, my mum's hands pressed to her mouth. What was that?" my dad croaked, his voice barely audible. I swallowed hard, blinking back tears. I don't know," I whispered. I don't know what she is." My mum let out a choked sob, her shoulders shaking. My dad just stared at me, his expression unreadable. "Helen," he whispered, and for the first time I saw it, the fear in his eyes raw and desperate. "What have you done?" I couldn't answer. I didn't know how. All I knew was that I'd unleashed something I didn't understand, something I couldn't control. We didn't speak about what happened that night. Not really. My parents didn't call the police. They didn't even tell Father Martin's congregation he'd been to our house. They cleaned up the mess, buried his body somewhere deep in the woods, and swore to each other and to me that no one would ever know. We'd pretend like it never happened, like Helen never existed. But I knew they were scared of me. I could see it in the way my dad's gaze flitted away whenever I tried to talk to him, in the way he flinched if I came too close. My mum wouldn't look at me at all. She'd shuffle around the house, eyes downcast, whispering prayers under her breath like they were the only thing holding her together. Sometimes I'd catch her watching me from the doorway when she thought I wasn't looking, her face pale, eyes wide and glassy, as if she were looking at a stranger, as if she were afraid I might snap at any moment. And maybe she was right, because deep down I was afraid too. I stayed in my room most days, curled up on the bed, staring blankly at the wall. I couldn't feel her anymore, not like I used to. The room was cold and empty, a hollow echo of what it had been when we played together, night after night. I called out to her sometimes, desperate, pleading, but she never answered. It was like she'd disappeared, like she'd faded away into whatever dark place spirits go when they're done. But I knew she was still there. I could feel it, lingering at the edges of my mind, a faint, whispering presence, watching, waiting. And then one night, everything changed. I'd been lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, when I felt it, a soft, featherlight brush against my cheek. My heart stuttered, my breath catching in my throat. "Helen," I whispered, sitting up slowly. "Is that you?" No response. But the air shifted, a chill creeping through the room, raising goosebumps on my arms. I swallowed hard, staring into the darkness. I hesitated, fear and hope warring in my chest. "I'm sorry," I whispered, my voice trembling. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen. I didn't want to hurt you." The silence was thick, suffocating. For a moment I thought she might not respond, that I was just talking to myself again. And then, slowly, the letters began to appear. They scrawled themselves across the mirror on my dresser, one by one, in jagged, frost-covered lines. "Why did you let him hurt me?" My breath caught. I scrambled out of bed, stumbling to the mirror, my eyes wide. I tried to stop him, Helen. I tried, but I couldn't." The letters shifted, the frost shimmering, twisting, reforming. You didn't stop him. Tears welled in my eyes. I know, I whispered, my voice breaking. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Why? The question hung in the air, icy and unforgiving. I stared at the words, my chest tight, my heart aching. I was scared, I choked out. I didn't know what to do. The mirror cracked. I flinched, stumbling back, my pulse racing. The frost spread like a spider's web, creeping outward from the center of the glass. I watched, trembling as the lines twisted and curled, spelling out one final word. Liar. I let out a choked sob, dropping to my knees. Please, I begged. Please, Helen, But she was already gone. The room fell silent again, the cold dissipating, leaving me alone in the dark. After that night, the hauntings changed. They weren't friendly anymore. They weren't playful, like the games we used to play. There were no more touches, no more gentle breezes. Instead, there were whispers, faint hissing voices that echoed through the house at night, filling the silence with a low, menacing hum. Doors would slam shut behind me when I walked through the hallways. Lights would flicker, then snap off, plunging me into darkness. Objects would go missing, books, clothes, even pieces of furniture, and reappear in strange places, stacked precariously in the middle of rooms, arranged in bizarre, spiraling patterns. And then there were the scratches. They started small, tiny, shallow marks carved into the walls, the floors, the furniture. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, but they got worse. They got deeper, longer. Soon they were everywhere, dozens, hundreds of jagged lines gouged into the wood and plaster, crisscrossing every surface of the house. One morning I woke up to find them on my arms. Long, angry gashes crisscrossing my skin, bleeding sluggishly. I stared at them, numb with shock, and then at the message carved into the wall above my bed. Traitor. I didn't tell my parents. I couldn't. They'd already started avoiding me, moving around the house like I was some ghost haunting them. I didn't want to give them another reason to be afraid. So I just bandaged the cuts, put on a long-sleeved shirt, and tried to pretend everything was fine. But it wasn't. It would never be fine again. The weeks dragged by, slow and torturous. The hauntings grew worse. My parents finally decided to leave, whispering in hushed voices about moving away, getting a fresh start somewhere far, far from the house and whatever nightmare I'd brought into our lives. They thought leaving would save them. They were wrong. Because the night before we were supposed to go, Helen came back. I woke up to the sound of glass shattering. I sat bolt upright, heart pounding, and stumbled out of bed, my legs trembling. The air was freezing. The room so cold I could see my breath misting in front of me. Helen, I whispered, fear twisting in my gut. What's going on? A high, keening wail echoed through the house, making my skin crawl. I staggered into the hallway, my pulse racing. Mom? Dad? No answer. I turned the corner, my heart in my throat, and froze. My parents were standing in the living room, their eyes wide and glassy, their faces pale and bloodless. The air around them shimmered, thick with frost. I took a step forward, then another, my heart hammering against my ribs. And then I saw it. The shadow. It loomed behind them, a hulking, twisted shape of darkness and ice, its eyes black pits of rage and malice. I sucked in a breath, stumbling back. Helen, no! I screamed. Please don't hurt them! The spirit didn't move. It just hovered there, its gaze fixed on me, unblinking, unforgiving. Please, I begged, tears streaming down my face. I'm sorry, I'm so sorry. Just let them go. Let them go. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. And then, slowly, the spirit shifted. My parents' eyes rolled back in their heads. They crumpled to the floor, limp and lifeless. No! I screamed, rushing forward. I dropped to my knees, shaking them frantically. Mom, Dad, please! But it was too late. They were gone. And as I knelt there, sobbing over their bodies, the shadow slowly faded away, leaving me alone. Alone with the darkness I'd created. I moved in with my grandparents shortly afterward. I never heard from the ghost again, and never dabbled in the occult again. But what happened? It shook me. I don't believe in any of it now. The prayers, the rituals, the promises of salvation. And I'll never set foot in a church again, not for as long as I live. My parents' deaths were ruled the result of a break-in and an attempted robbery. That's what the police decided anyway. It was easy to blame it on that, considering the state the house was in. I kept tight-lipped, always claiming I'd been asleep in my room during the worst of it, hiding myself away from the violence. To this day, it's a cold case, and it'll stay that way forever. Colder than anyone knows. Before anyone feels the need to state the obvious, I know I'm not a good person. I'm a cheater, always have been. I could lie. I could tell you about how my dad wasn't around or some Freudian bullshit about how every girl I ever dated could never match up to my mother, but it wouldn't be the truth. I didn't have a hard life, and my relationship with my mother is healthy. I'm just an asshole, but I didn't deserve this. Brian, you're the best thing that has ever happened to me, but I need just a little more time, Blythe whispered, her long blonde hair falling over her reddening, gorgeous face. Yeah, sorry. It's only been 9 months, I scoffed. I bit my lip. I've never really handled rejection well. It isn't that my ego is fragile or anything. Pride is just hard. You're worth the wait. I have work in the morning. I brushed her hair out of her face and chastely kissed her soft lips. I should have just gone home and went to bed, rubbed one out for good measure, but a scorned man goes where his dick and the night will carry him. On the drive home, I pressed my thumb against my cell phone screen like a worry stone and thought of Shelley. She was a 6.5 out of 10 on a good day, but she never said no. The phone rang twice on my end before she picked up. How soon do you want me over? Shelley purred. I liked that. No hello, no small talk, and best of all, no, I need more time. How about you host tonight? I was in the area. I'm about 5 minutes out. The thought of Shelley in my bed like old times was a nice one, but I didn't want to risk anyone seeing her car there. I knew Blythe had no reason to be suspicious, no reason to follow me, but I was careful. I'd always been careful. Shelley agreed. She always did. I was there right on time. I hesitated just for a second in her driveway. I almost pulled back out, but then I started replaying the shock in Blythe's eyes when I asked, the way she softened her voice when she told me she wanted to take a little more time, like she thought my feelings needed sparing, that I'd fall apart and cry or something. Her infantilizing tone was too much. Pride has a way of really fucking things up, and so do I. Less than a half hour later, I wasn't thinking about that anymore. I was busy getting tangled in the sheets with Shelley. In the heat of the moment, I felt something sting my back. I tried to swipe it off, not wanting to be distracted from her, but it was starting to burn. As I twisted to get a better smack at my back, I saw Blythe at the window, blonde hair floating in the wind, and her face pressed hard against the glass. I scrambled to turn around and claw my way through the tangled sheets. In all my glorious efforts, I only succeeded in falling off of the bed and smacking my cheekbone on the wooden frame on my way down. Shelley squeaked at the sharp smack. Something between a stutter, beatboxing, and a juvenile attempt at profanity fell out of my mouth. I finally untangled myself enough to turn towards the now vacant window. Blythe was gone. I ran out the front door, stark naked to an empty street. Not even taillights winked in the distance. Get back inside! Have you lost your mind? Someone's going to call the cops! Shelley's screams rattled in between my ears. I'm sure they would if she kept it up. I glanced one more time down the empty road and turned back inside. I didn't mention Blythe when I tried to explain my sudden interest in streaking, but I did tell her I thought there was someone outside the window. At this point, I was starting to doubt that Blythe had been there at all. Hell, that anyone had been there at all. Maybe it was guilt. Either way, the night was ruined. I didn't kiss her when I left. I didn't even look back. The gravel crunched under my Corolla as it crawled down my street. My heart thumped in time with the rolling tires, imagining Blythe waiting in the driveway. Maybe a brick through my window. Something. But there was no sign of Blythe, her car, nor any vandalism. Lost in thought, I smashed the brake with the nose of my car inches from the garage door. The spot on my back started to tingle. I jingled my keys as I half-skipped to the entryway. I shook my head and grinned. I'd call Blythe in the morning to be sure. But I was confident at this point that I had made a mistake at Shelley's. I kicked myself internally. But there'd be another night. There always was. After a fast shower, I checked my back. Except for a small red dot, there was nothing to blame for the burning. Could it have been an asp? Do spider bites burn? A bee sting? My mind wandered, but I didn't have any solid answer. Maybe I should be ashamed to admit it, but as soon as my head hit the pillow, I was asleep. Guilt couldn't override my exhaustion, and I wasn't all that sure I felt guilty anyway. My dreams told another story, though. My pupils dilated with such ferocity, adjusting to the dim lighting of Blythe's living room. I could feel the stretch in my eyes. Although my chest heaved with effort, I could only whisper her name. She responded with laughter, the tinkle of an amused child. My heart battered in my chest. The pain from the bug bite on my back dialed up to 11. Sharp appendages caressed the edges from the inside. I choked on the scream, trying to throw itself from my lips. I could feel something soft pushing from my stomach, blooming in my esophagus. I gave a forceful cough and felt a thick, squishy lump fly up from my throat and flop onto my tongue. Gagging, I pulled a clump of Shelley's hair from my mouth. Long strands straggled up my throat as I removed the mass. All the while Blythe laughed. I woke up a mess, bloodshot eyes and my stomach in knots. I fumbled my phone and called Blythe. The certainty I'd had from last night was fading. The damn nightmare was playing tricks with my head, or my guilty conscience. Either way, I needed to know. The phone rang. Once, twice, 3 times. And she finally picked up. She sounded her usual chipper self. My voice cracked as I lied. I told her I'd called out from work, that I cared about her too much to leave things the way we had last night, and she ate it. She ate it well. The cramp in my stomach released. We made dinner plans and hung up. I tried to lay back down, eager to get some restful sleep, but my body wouldn't comply. The relief I felt wasn't enough to appease the burning on my back. I stumbled to the bathroom. Upon further investigation, what was once a small dot had most definitely spread. The center appeared to have crusted over a bit. No matter how I twisted or contorted, it rested solidly between my shoulder blades, just out of reach. The crusted head on the mound taunted and begged for the sensual scratch of my fingernails. But there was a bigger problem. My cheek was swollen where I'd smacked it on Shelley's bed frame the night before, a light purple shadow licking the apple. Another lie I'd need to invent to cover my tracks. It was never the cheating that bothered me. It was the lying. It was the having to remember. It was an irritating inconvenience. I pulled out my phone to text an apology to Shelley. Given the giant pain in the ass this all had been, I doubt I'd be seeing her for a while, but I believed in keeping all my bridges intact for the crossing. As an afterthought, I asked if she'd been bitten by anything lately. As I rotted in bed waiting for a reply, soft, dreamless sleep found me. My eyes thrust open as the lump on my back radiated pain. Both cheeks boasted that just-smacked tingle that teased of a fever. I started to think about the time I'd been playing in a brush pile as a child. A black widow had bitten me, and I'd been dog-shit sick for a few days. But did it burn? I checked the time and nearly tripped over myself throwing clothes on to meet Blythe. No word still from Shelley. Maybe my odd behavior had spooked her, but no response at all. Weird. No time to think on it now. I hastily deleted the text thread and shot one to Blythe, telling her I was on my way. I wouldn't normally go to dinner sick, but I needed to see Blythe. I just couldn't shake that something was off, and I needed my mind at ease. I popped a couple of ibuprofen and headed out the door. For the first time in 9 months of seeing her, Blythe was late. This shit day was turning out to have plenty of firsts. It had only been 5 minutes at this point, no big deal. I tried to tell myself that maybe there was traffic. A flat tire. She couldn't find her keys. Anything other than her standing me up. The next 5, I started to feel a twinge of rot in the bottom of my stomach. She was outside the window, saw everything, and was standing me up as punishment. My armpits leaked fever sweat. I was angry. Just as I scooted my seat back to leave, she walked in. Sorry, couldn't decide on shoes. She struck a pose with her heel lifted before gliding into her seat. I couldn't help but chuckle. I was about to lose it over a woman and her shoes. Blythe was completely herself, smiling and beautiful. I was trying to keep things light, but I'd started to sweat all over now. The thick kind, the kind that refuses to drip, the kind that reminds you of that kid in 3rd grade who spat on you on the bus and it globbed on your cheek. Oh, the kid sucked air and one dared you to do something, but you wore that glob like a coward's badge and did nothing. You sat there with your head down until you're stopped, staring at the congealed mess on your sleeve, and you look like shit. Are you all right? Blythe's eyebrow was hiked higher than a whore's skirt, and I cackled right there at the table. My stomach heaved. I wasn't all right, we both knew it, but only one of us knew why. She settled the tab and invited me over to her place to take care of me. I know I didn't deserve it, but I needed it. Even the dim lights in the restaurant were starting to bother my eyes. This is where things get a little fuzzy. I remember most of the drive. I remember seeing Blythe's door, and then I remember waking up on her couch with the phone to my ear, still ringing. I shook my pounding head and answered, "Brian Pond, this is Detective Waysome." He sucked air but didn't wait for confirmation. "We're investigating the disappearance of Shelley Moore. She was reported missing by some friends 5 days ago. It looks like the last call on her log was to your number in the area of 4 a.m. that morning. Do you have some time?" My eyes flew open fully now. "I haven't seen her. 5 days? I'm sorry, I haven't been feeling well." My pitch rose as my vocal cords stretched and seized. "I have to go, but I'll call you. I'll call you." His voice had begun to leak out of the speaker, but I couldn't listen anymore. I jammed my finger repeatedly on end call. I had been with Shelley last night, so how had she been missing for 5 days? None of this made sense. There was no way I'd been asleep on this couch for days. Blythe would have taken me to the hospital, right? I needed answers, and if the sharp stabbing behind my eyes was any indication, possibly an ambulance. The lining of my brain squeezed as I called for Blythe. The reverberation of my voice off the high ceilings, followed by the somber silence, lifted the hairs on the back of my neck. I tried to stand, but my legs buckled under my weight. My body sagged. On my second attempt, I managed to stumble down the hall to Blythe's room. I slid my hand against the wall to guide me as I walked, still not trusting my legs not to crumble under the weight of the raging fever. The patterns on the floor swirled under my feet with each step. I had to be hallucinating. My heart rate hiked, and I called for Blythe again. Still only silence. Near panicked, I pushed through Blythe's door. Shelley was sitting on the bed, undressed and unmoving, as Blythe carved the last bit of a symbol on her chest. Candles on every surface illuminated the room. My dry, swollen throat wouldn't allow me to scream. A skull with grey chunks of meat still attached sat in the center of an altar on the dresser. The walls were covered in symbols. My breath hiked in my chest as I noted that a few matched those carved onto Shelley. Blythe brushed Shelley's hair back from her face and tucked it behind her ear, her smile slowly melting into a frown. This had to be a hallucination, a fever dream, something. My brain was cracking and aching, trying to comprehend the scene unfolding before me. My throat finally unlocked, and I whispered Blythe's name. She finally turned to me, standing in the doorway, and her smile returned. She gently patted a spot on the bed twice beside Shelley, gesturing for me to sit. I didn't want to. I wanted nothing more than to run, but my legs operated, but my legs weren't my own. They marched themselves to the edge of the bed, and I sat. Blythe looked at me with the eyes of a mother regarding their toddler they'd caught twirling their fingers in the toilet water for the 3rd time in a day. Disappointed, slightly disgusted, but still with love. Vomit inched from my stomach towards my throat. I was terrified. "Let's start being honest with each other, okay, Brian?" She tilted her head while her eyes bore into me. A small smirk quivered on her lips. "I know about Shelley. I saw everything. I can't even begin to tell you how disappointed I am." She paused for a second as she sucked in a big breath. Her face relaxed and returned her familiar beauty. "I sent a little friend home with you to see what you'd do, to see if things were worth salvaging, and boy, was I sorely disappointed." She clicked her tongue and her eyes bulged. "You slept well, considering what was growing inside of you, and then texted her right after you made plans to see me. Not cool, Brian, not cool at all." Blythe was pacing back and forth in front of her bed, erratically throwing her hands around as she spoke. I kept my face as emotionless as possible and listened. I was terrified to say the wrong thing to her. The longer she spoke, the more her eyes began to bulge in and out like a fucked-up cuckoo clock. Spit flew from her mouth with every accusation. The smell of burning hair wafted across the room. My eyes flicked to the altar where a small clump of hair singed from a nearby candle. Blythe's grin stretched, showing all her teeth. I imagined her biting into chunks of my skin and swallowing like a crazed cannibal, making sure I'd never be able to leave her. Fear was eating the small remnants of the rational part of my brain that was left. Her bulging eyes now glittered with interest, like she could see inside of me, like she knew. "Right, that. I guess you're not the only one keeping secrets, Brian. But I told you I needed more time. But before we get into any of that, let me help you with your back." Blythe danced her way behind the bed, humming. The creaking of the springs in the mattress as she crawled towards me twisted my stomach. She slid her legs on either side of my body and twirled her finger gently in circles around the monstrosity on my back. She leaned in close, her hot breath against my back and lips brushing me in a way that bordered erotic as she whispered. My legs still wouldn't work to run. When the whispering stopped, she ran her hot tongue across the lump. As the saliva cooled, something began to pulse under the surface of my skin, pushing and stretching its way out. "Yes, you're doing such a good job." Blythe squealed. "What a good girl! Come meet my friends!" There was a flat pop as the pain in my back peaked and then subsided. My body crumbled forward as I wept from the pain. I felt flaps of skin flutter as the thing set two fuzzy feet onto either side of the wound and heaved itself out of my back. It scurried up to my shoulder and twitched as it hesitantly hovered its furry, bloody leg at the entrance to my ear. "You won't fit in there anymore, silly. You've gotten too big," Blythe cooed. I shivered as it twitched once more before jumping onto Shelley. Blythe unwrapped her legs around me, clapping gleefully as she made her way back around the bed to watch. I knew what it was the second I felt its legs on me, but admitting it while it crawled out of my skin would have taken me past the point of insanity. Now that I could see it on Shelley, I couldn't deny myself the truth anymore. It was a spider, a huge goddamn spider. It clamped its legs around Shelley's head with its abdomen pressed hard against her face. I had no knowledge of nor experience with giant spiders, but my brain screamed that it was eating her. I couldn't help it. I puked and sobbed. The last bit of hope that clung to all of this being a fever dream died as a low, muffled moan leaked from Shelley's mouth underneath the spider's fat body. Blythe grabbed a jar off the altar and threw it at my head, narrowly missing. The jar shattered as it smashed behind me. A combination of ammonia and rot replaced the singed hair smell. The symbol behind me smeared as the foul liquid wept down the wall. "Don't you dare fucking cry for her, Brian. She's a whore," Blythe sobbed as she screamed. As more of the symbols smeared behind us, I felt a pressure release from my legs. I could wiggle my toes. Blythe was wailing with her hands ripping at her hair. The spider didn't seem bothered by the noise, still pulsing and shivering against Shelley's moaning face. Blythe had completely lost it. If I thought I was terrified before, I lacked the words to describe what I felt at that moment. There was no doubt in my mind. Blythe was going to kill me. My eyes darted, looking for a weapon. Finally, they landed on a snow globe I'd bought Blythe a month ago on our trip to New York. Sleeping with Blythe in the hotel was where the idea of living together was born, where I had decided I didn't want to spend any more nights without her in my arms, where this whole mess started. I snatched the globe from its place on the stand and slammed it against Blythe's head as hard as I could. Blythe dropped to the floor. The room fell silent except for Shelley's ever-softening moans. I couldn't be sure Blythe wasn't faking, but I couldn't bring myself to check. I needed to get out of there as fast as possible, for my sanity more than my safety. I slammed the door behind me to trap the spider inside and ran to the garage. I wanted nothing more than to run, but I had to be sure the spider was dead. I couldn't end up like Shelley. I grabbed the gas canister for the mower, and with a fresh wave of nausea, headed back into the house. I threw gas on the curtains before splattering a trail to Blythe's bedroom door. Shelley didn't deserve to die here, but as far as I knew, she was gone the second the spider suctioned itself to her face. I grabbed the matches by the fireplace, lit one, and threw it onto the curtain before finally running out the door and tasting the night air. I tripped over my feet before landing on the lawn. Blood loss and shock were whispering to stay, to let this soft grass be home. I was so tired, but images of Shelley sitting naked, the life being sucked out of her, broke me of giving up, and adrenaline surged once more. I shakily pulled myself up and into my car. I drove for 2 hours straight before my gaslight dinged. I booked the closest no-contact hotel room and arrived on fumes. I was covered in sweat, puke, and blood. The plan, however poor, was to clean up, rest only for an hour, refill my car, and keep driving. Put as much distance as possible between everything that had happened and myself. I wanted so badly to believe I had made all of it up, that Shelley was fine and not texting me back because I had made an ass out of myself, that I had slept through the dinner with Blythe, that I was still asleep, dreaming the most fucked up fever dream I'd ever had in my life. But the pain from the gaping hole in my back wouldn't let me pretend. I'm not ashamed to admit I cried in the shower until the lines in my hands were peaks and valleys. I tore up the bed sheets to make a makeshift bandage for my back. It looks disgusting, but I can't get help. I can't even begin to think of a story I could tell the hospital that would explain my injuries, or if the police were looking for me for Shelley, or the fire, or Blythe. Even exhaustion hasn't blessed me with sleep. Every time I close my eyes, I picture Shelley naked with symbols carved all over her body, covered in webs. The spider on her face, pulsing and shaking in ecstasy with hundreds of babies on its back. I should have stood on the lawn and watched the whole house burn, just to be sure. I went out to the car and got my work laptop to search for news articles on the fire I started at Blythe's, but the information was limited. As of the last time I searched, they hadn't reported any bodies. It's being referred to as an accidental fire. My mind was still swimming, so I started to write. I need someone to know my story. I need them to know that I never meant for this to happen. Even after almost a year of seeing Blythe, loving her, I had no idea she was into anything like this. She never once acted unstable in the entire relationship. I never meant to hurt Shelley. She didn't deserve to be caught up in this mess, and I shouldn't have left her. For the last 10 minutes, I've heard something softly tapping at my hotel door. Fear has a way of filling in the gaps. My brain tells me the feet are soft but strong, furry and many. I won't get up and I won't look. I've seen enough. There's a storm coming. I can hear Blythe's tinkering laughter riding on the winds, the giggling of a child who knows they're about to pull a very naughty trick. Losing someone you're close to is always a horrific experience, but when you lose that someone in a sudden and strange way right before your eyes, it hurts so much worse. That someone was my best friend, Harry. We'd known each other for the better part of 6 years. I first met Harry on move-in day at Massachusetts Maritime Academy. He was one of my roommates and we hit it off pretty much right away. I don't remember how it came up exactly, but it turned out we both had a niche interest in cryptozoology. In what little free time we were given at the academy, we would drive out to the infamous Bridgewater Triangle in search of whatever paranormal activity there might be. Ghosts, pukwudgies, UFOs, you name it. Neither of us truly believed that we'd ever find anything. We mostly just used our little misadventures as an excuse to drink in the woods. The closest we ever came to some kind of supernatural encounter was when we stumbled across a hairless raccoon. It was certainly the strangest thing we ever saw out there. Those 4 years were some of the hardest in my life, and if it weren't for Harry, they very well could have been the last. As cliché as it sounds, he became a brother to me. I'd even go visit his family with him on vacation and holidays. His parents would jokingly refer to me as their long-lost kid. Our graduation was one of the hardest days of my life. I've never been good with goodbyes, even with people I didn't like, but Harry was on a whole other level. I nearly cried in front of his whole family. Thank God I didn't. Harry went on to work for a tanker company based out of Seattle, and I went off to work on tugboats in Alaska. We kept in touch the whole time, but it just wasn't the same as seeing him in person. Our schedules didn't line up well either, so we couldn't ever really see each other. That went on for about 2 years before I expressed interest in going to work on the tanker with him. He seemed pretty excited about the idea and offered to put in a good word for me. He had already worked himself up to the position of third mate and was on pretty good terms with a couple of the captains there, so I figured his word was good and went for it. I ended up getting the job and started pretty quickly after finishing my last hitch with the tugs. I was even lucky enough to get to work my first hitch on the tanker with Harry. It was the first time I got to really spend time with him in 2 years, and it was nice to have a friendly face to help me adjust to life on the tanker. Working on a new ship is always a nerve-wracking experience, especially one as large as the one I was now living on. It was about 680 feet from bow to stern, which is relatively small for a tanker. Life aboard was actually really nice. Since these hitches are pretty long, they make sure there are a lot of accommodations aboard, a dedicated cook, TVs, a gym, and there was even a driving simulator set up. Between Harry and the ship herself, it seemed like this was going to be a great fit for me, and I was excited to start my first voyage aboard. We would be leaving from LA and heading to Japan. The whole trip should take about 20 days, given we avoid any major setbacks. Looking back at it now, it's hard to fathom how differently I would feel on the other side of those 20 days. The first few days went fairly well. Most of life on a ship underway is routine maintenance, cleaning and standing watch. Lookout watches were my favorite, whether it be at the helm itself or just helping to keep an eye out. Not too much goes on in the middle of the Pacific, so a lot of the time I'd be up there with Harry, and we'd just joke around and share stories with the rest of the crew on the bridge. There were a couple of occasions where we had to make passing arrangements with another vessel, or we got reports of free-floating containers in the area, but aside from that, it was pretty uneventful. It wasn't until the 8th day that it would change. I wasn't on the bridge when this happened, but Harry filled me in when he saw me. The incident occurred during the night watch. Lights were spotted on the horizon, which is not an uncommon occurrence at all, as lights are used to identify ships and communicate critical info, like what sides you are seeing so you can determine what direction the ship is headed. For example, all ships have a green light on their starboard side, red on the port, a white light on the stern and masthead, and then there are yellow lights to indicate if they're towing something. What was uncommon about the lights were their color. Apparently it was a horizontal line of interchanging green and purple lights. There are no vessels that use purple lights in any scenario. There was some talk of maybe they were actually red and just looked purple at a distance for whatever reason, but even then that pattern of red and green isn't used at all in the maritime world. They disappeared after about 20 minutes and weren't seen again. It really wasn't that significant of an incident at all, and was forgotten about almost immediately, but it was the first in a series of strange occurrences. Harry especially didn't think much of it, although he did crack a joke saying it might have been a flock of ropen. If you've never heard of them, ropen are a cryptid from the southwest Pacific that are basically just glowing pterodactyls. I laughed, but deep down I thought about how cool it would be to see some kind of sea monster while we were out here, like how the sailors of old would talk about seeing mermaids or kraken. It was a childish fantasy, but my fantasy nonetheless. The next day we would stumble across the next strange occurrence of our journey, and this time I would be the one to witness it. I was out on bow watch, where I would stand at the very front of the ship to help keep a lookout instead of up on the bridge. I spotted something floating in the water about 500 feet off our port side. It looked fairly large, so I called it out to the captain on the radio. I then took a closer look through my binoculars and realized what was in the water. It was a dead whale. There were even a few sharks feasting on it. It didn't look like it had been dead for long. While it's not a typical sight, coming across a dead whale is by no means an unnatural one. I've seen pictures and videos of scenes just like this before, but what I haven't seen before is the types of injuries this dead whale had. There were the easily explainable ones, such as the large chunks of missing flesh from the opportunistic sharks, or holes pecked into the surface of the whale from seabirds. But then there were the long, deep gashes in the whale. They were straight, almost parallel lines, and the flesh around the wounds seemed almost charred. I'm by no means an expert on decaying whales, so I very well may have just misunderstood what the process of decay looks like on a whale, but nonetheless something about it just felt off to me. The bridge team seemed to have gotten a kick out of it. The captain even took a picture to send to his wife, who was a middle school science teacher, so she could show her class. The thought of the ropen entered my head again. The childish side of me thought maybe, just maybe, this whale was a victim of that flock, and the gashes in its side were from the mighty claws of those bioluminescent pterosaurs. It certainly was the funnest explanation I could think of. Maybe that's what I'll tell my kids someday, if I ever have kids at least. I radioed up to Harry, joking about the ropen, to which I got a quick laugh back, and a confused captain asking, "What the hell is a ropen?" I embarrassingly explained it in the most simple way I could think of, a glowing pterodactyl, to which the captain only said, "Oh, okay, sweet." Another 2 days would go by without incident, but the next occurrence would be much more notable. Yet, again, I was there for what happened. This time I was up on the bridge at the helm when something strange appeared on our radar. It was showing a large target about 15 miles off of our starboard bow. Based on the size of the blob on the radar, it would have been roughly the same size as us, but it could not be spotted with the bare eye or our ECDIS boat GPS. We were nowhere near any land masses whatsoever, and even if we were, we should have been able to see it. The weather was completely clear, and our visibility was well past 15 miles. There was no land, and there were no ships. Large targets appearing out of nowhere on radar is actually somewhat normal due to subrefraction and other science nonsense I could not care enough to memorize, but what isn't normal is these ghost targets being given ARPA data. ARPA is an add-on to radar that will automatically track targets in your area and warn you if they become a danger. ARPA will automatically calculate the target's speed, course, distance to you, CPA, closest point of approach, and TCPA, time of CPA. Our ARPA was giving us all of this data on the target, meaning that something was actually there and that something was moving. According to the ARPA, it wouldn't be a danger to our course and was in fact moving away from us. This was pretty confusing to everyone on the bridge, including the captain. There was no real explanation for this, other than it just being a really weird glitch. However, the captain decided to take extra precaution anyway and ordered the lookouts to keep an eye out for our ghost, if it was in fact real. No one ever caught a glimpse of it. I tried to think of a way I could tie this into my ever-growing ropen lore, but it was just too weird of an incident, and unless you had somewhat of an understanding of how radar works, it's not one you'd find any significance in. Instead, I tried to turn it into its own sea story. I settled on our radar picking up on a ghost ship. I was pretty proud of that one, but I never got around to telling Harry, which was a real shame because I think he would have really liked it, and now I'll never have the chance to tell him. As weird as that whole ghost radar situation was, It would not be the last of the day's weirdness. In the last hour of the day watch, we started to get some very strange communications over the radio. It had been 4 days since we last communicated with another vessel, and 3 since we heard any communications over the radio at all. All vessels are supposed to monitor 2 different radio channels at all times. Channel 13 for general communications, and Channel 16 for emergency communications, your maydays, sinking ships, fires, etc. These new chatterings were coming over Channel 16. What we heard was almost nonsense. They were complete sentences, but they were without clear context or purpose, and the message was being spoken interchangeably by different voices, switching word from word. The voices of both men and women with various accents would all take turns speaking as if it was a mad lib. From what I remember, it went something like this: American male, pon-pon, British male, this, Scandinavian female vessel, Indian male, in need, American female, immediate, Eastern European male, passing, British male request, Japanese male, stay, Middle Eastern male, course, French female, starboard, Chinese male, passing. The voices then cut out to brief static and then silence. The captain was more annoyed than anything. Everyone chalked it up to interference and the message to just be nonsense. But it sat with me, as chaotic and jumbled as the message was. It was clearly trying to communicate something to us. Whoever made that message urgently needed us to stay on course. I'm not sure why they would have chosen to do it like that, instead of just communicating normally. The wording of the transmission was also strange. It got the message across, but it was done so choppily, like whoever made it did not have a great grasp of the English language, or only had a limited amount of words it could use. The whole situation just did not sit right with me. The only way I can describe it was as uncanny. After our watch ended, I took Harry aside and asked him what he thought of today. He didn't seem to be anywhere near as freaked out as I was, but he did admit that the strange occurrences of today were both firsts for him. He told me not to worry. That weird shit just happens sometimes, especially when you're trapped in a metal box all day surrounded by hundreds of miles of nothingness. He then threw out another quick joke about ghosts and sea monsters. I was still in my head when he said it, so I didn't catch the whole thing, but I laughed anyway because I probably would have thought whatever he actually said was funny. After our little talk, we went down to the galley to get some food before we called it for the night. Even after hanging out with Harry, I was still a bit shaken up. I ended up having some pretty intense nightmares that night. I forgot what they were almost immediately after waking up, but I think it had to do with ghosts being on the ship or something like that. I don't think I was alone in the night I had, because the whole ship had a solemn mood the next day. My gut is telling me something happened to the night crew, something strange, but none of them said anything, and the ones I specifically asked said that it was just a quiet night. The weather even reflected the mood. It wasn't bad weather by any means, just overcast with some light rain. It wouldn't take long until the day took a grim turn. After only an hour or two into the watch, we came across another vessel, a small sailboat drifting all by its lonesome. It was spotted by the bow lookout. The mast was cracked in half and fell into the water, taking the sail with it. The deck was an absolute mess with debris and gear scattered everywhere. The hatch to the interior was also left wide open with no one in sight. The captain tried hailing the small vessel on the radio to no avail. We blared our horn to try to get the attention of anyone that might be aboard, but yet again there was no response. The captain called the vessel in to nearby authorities and warned any nearby traffic of the derelict vessel. He then decided to use our rescue boat, a small boat used for man-overboard scenarios, to send a small team of the deck crew to investigate the boat and see if there is anyone in need of immediate medical assistance. It may take hours for a Coast Guard or naval vessel to get to our position, and the captain did not want to risk leaving someone to die. I volunteered to be a part of the boarding party, along with 3 other crew members. We were able to get alongside the sailboat fairly quickly and easily. 3 of us climbed onto the boat and performed a quick investigation. There was no one aboard, but everything on the inside seemed untouched. Food was still on the table. Life jackets were still stored away, and there was a camera sitting next to a laptop on a counter. We were specifically instructed not to touch anything unless there was an injured person aboard, so I didn't investigate further, but there was already a grim fate being painted for whoever was the crew of this vessel. You could be the best swimmer in the world, but you won't survive for long in the water without a life jacket. After making absolutely sure there was no one aboard, we returned to our own vessel and reported to the captain, with the US Navy sending a ship over to investigate and organize a search and rescue operation, and no one in immediate danger. We were free to continue on our way. Not many words were spoken for the rest of the day. The next day was the climax of all this strange phenomenon, and by far the worst day of my life. One of the guys who boarded the sailboat with me ended up getting extremely sick. I'm pretty sure it was just nerves, but either way he was puking his guts out and was in no shape to be performing his tasks for the day. We also entered an incredibly thick fog bank, due to the importance of having a bow lookout and the fear that me and the two other guys that boarded the sailboat might have also contracted something. Harry volunteered to do bow lookout, even though that was technically below his duties. The captain thought that was for the best and kept us inside. Traveling through fog is always a nerve-wracking experience, especially after the day we had, and the possibility of an outbreak aboard the vessel. The bridge was masked in absolute silence. The only thing that could be heard was our fog signal, which blared every minute or so, a loud whistle followed by a distinct gong. The only other thing that could be heard were the periodic interruptions from Harry updating us from the bow. This would go on for 2 hours until Harry came through the radio sounding frantic. He started to hear something close, something loud. I can still hear everything he said perfectly. It's ingrained into my head. Hey, Cap, I hear something. I'm not sure what it is exactly. It doesn't sound like a foghorn or a buoy, but it's definitely not natural, and it's close. Real close. I think it's getting closer. It's getting louder, at least. It's like this weird whirring sound. I don't know how else to explain it. Oh, and the air. It's getting warmer. Real warmer. Cap, I don't know what's going on. The captain tried to calm him down. Keep calm. Harry, you're good. We're good as long as it's not a ship, it's okay. Even if it's a buoy, we'll just knock the fucker out of the way. Ain't that right, Harry? Ah, yeah, Cap, that's right. I think I see the sun peeking out from the clouds, so that should be a good sign, right? As Harry spoke, we could see the light he was talking about, but it wasn't the sun. It was a large, wide beam of light aimed directly at Harry. It kept growing brighter and brighter and brighter until we could not bear to keep our eyes open anymore. Harry attempted to contact us one more time, but his voice was quickly drowned out by static. Hey, case, kes. The blinding light and deafening static went on for a few more seconds, a gruelingly long few more seconds. Then both the light and static disappeared at once, before my eyes could even adjust back to the dim, dark lighting of the bridge. The captain was already blindly reaching out to grab the radio. He desperately tried to hail Harry to see if he was okay, but Harry was not answering. He ordered me to grab my life jacket and get my ass down there to see what was going on. I sprinted as fast as I could, barely even getting my life vest on as I ran a small marathon to the front of the ship. When I reached my destination, my heart was pounding out of my chest from both anxiety and exhaustion. As I tried to catch my breath, I realized Harry was nowhere in sight. I instinctively grabbed my radio and yelled, "Man overboard." Almost as soon as I said it, I could feel the massive vessel start to make a drastic change in course. We hailed any and all nearby vessels for assistance. Thanks to the search for whoever owned that sailboat, there were already a decent amount of naval and coast guard vessels in the area. But even with all of their resources, we couldn't find a single sign of Harry. We spent 8 hours looking for him. Eventually, the captain had to make the call no one wanted to make. We had to start making way to Japan. The longer we spent searching, the more fuel we'd burn, and if we burnt enough fuel, we'd never make it to Japan. Our only solace was that the Coast Guard would keep searching, and hopefully we'd get some good news by the time we finished our journey. Unfortunately, that good news never came. Eventually, the Coast Guard too had to call off their search. The aftermath was brutal. His family was torn apart. I was torn apart. His family is still holding out hope that he'll be found. They refuse to hold a funeral until they know for sure. I was not so hopeful, at least not at first. Even in the modern day, dying at sea is all too common. Once someone is in the water, it is a Herculean task to find them, especially with the restricted visibility that the fog had cursed us with. But it was a long way back from Japan, and I had a lot of time to think. We didn't have a single strange occurrence during the entire voyage back, which only made what we encountered on the way to Japan all the more peculiar. It was all just too strange, too much of a coincidence. The lights, the whale, the radar, the radio, the abandoned ship, and Harry. It all has to be connected. Harry didn't fall overboard. Something took him, but I don't know what. Ropens? Ghost? I just know that my friend didn't fall overboard. He's still out there somewhere, somehow.